In this video, we're going to summarize the four representations and how you can see the connections between all four of them. First, we're going to start off with looking at the table. The table is the first representation we're going to talk about. When we're dealing with linear graphs, graphs that make lines and that have a pattern that you've been seeing a lot of lately with the tile patterns, the table has to follow some sort of pattern. So that number between the 6 and 10 has to make a pattern with the 6 and 10. So the best number to put there would be 8, because then we can see that it goes from 6 to 8 and 8 to 10 by adding 2 each time. Now to go backwards in the table, of course we would go backwards with our rule and we go back 2. So we go down to 4 and then of course down to 2. That's how we would build a table for a linear situation. The next representation is graph. With the graph, I'm going to start by setting it up. I'm going to graph the table that I have. So the graph should also represent what we see in the table. And in the graph, I notice that with the table, I have the y values going all the way up to 10. So I'm going to set my axis going up by going by 2's so that I can fit all the way up to 10. I also notice that the x values only go from -2 to 2. So I'm just going to go by 1's along that axis. Now going downwards, of course, I would also have to go by 2's, but I'm seeing a problem. It's really hard to squeeze in the number -2. So I'm just going to jump to the number -4 right away. And that's okay, because that line above it represents, this line right here represents -2. So I don't have to label everything, but I need to label enough so my teacher and fellow students can follow what I'm trying to do. Now our third representation, oh wait, first we have to finish graphing, of course. So we're going to graph the 5 points that are in the table by graphing the x and the y, and of course this is my x-axis and this is my y-axis, always in every single graph. And then I'll simply plot the 5 points, and you should be doing this along with me. The next situation that we're going to look at is, the next representation is the situation. In the situation, remember, we're always describing, the situations you're seeing lately are tile patterns, but in the long run we're going to look at things like running and races. We're going to look at money growing in a bank account. We're going to look at some real life situations. The tile patterns were just there to introduce the rules, the graphs, and the tables to us so we're better at the math and we can apply it to harder situations. So the tile patterns, figure 0, of course, follows with the table in that it has 6 tiles. So figure 1 now has 8 according to the table. So I need to grow by 2, so I added 2 tiles onto the bottom. As long as there's a pattern, it doesn't matter where I put the 2 tiles, I'm just choosing to put them along the bottom. Now figure 2 has to have a similar pattern in that it grows up by 2 and it should follow the same rule and pattern as the previous 2, so I'm simply going to make it a longer rectangle. So a situation matches the table and the graph. So figure 1 having 8 tiles, in table it should have 1 should have 8, and in the graph 1 should have 8. All 3 of them match. Now for the rule. The rule is something you've been summarizing a lot lately. The rule is now talking about how to describe the relationship between x and y. The rule has always been y equals something times x plus something. So we have to find those 2 values. And here's what you should have noticed recently in your class. The number that you add on is always figure 0. That's always figure 0. Another word that we've used to describe that is the y-intercept. And you may or may not have heard that recently, or maybe you heard that in past years. That will be figure 0, and we'll talk about why it's called the y-intercept in just a second. The second number that goes in front of x is always your growth. It's how much the tile pattern is growing by, or maybe we talk about bank accounts, it's how much your bank account is growing by. So what we have to do is look at these 3 representations we already have and try to figure out these numbers. So let's take a look first at the growth. The growth, according to the tile pattern, the situation, we added 2 tiles, and you can see that in both of the additional tiles that were drawn. In the graph, we also can see the growth. So when we went over to figure 1 from figure 0, we went up 2 tiles from 6 to 8. So the growth is 2 no matter what representation you look at. We also saw a growth of 2 in the table up above. So that growth matters. You guys have been finding that growth for a long time. Now we're going to use that growth and put it in our rule. So 2x is the start of our rule because it's growing by 2 tiles every single time you go to the next figure. Now figure 0, we're going to look at figure 0. No matter which representation, if we look at the graph, go to figure 0, we would go up to 6. If we look at the situation, figure 0, 6 tiles. And if we look at the table, figure 0, 6 tiles. So figure 0 is 6, no matter which representation we look at. So those 2 numbers are key for all 4 representations, and all 4 of them are interconnected. Your goal in the long run is to be able to turn a situation into a table, turn a situation into a rule, or a graph. And of course we want to go the other way too. We also want to be able to turn the graph into the table, or the table into the graph. We want to be able to go all directions on this big web of representations and turn all of them into the other. That is the 4 representations and how they're all interconnected. Now we're going to mostly talk about the graph and the rule today. So all these arrows are connecting these representations. The only arrow we're going to be concerned about today is connecting the graph and the rule and going backwards, graph to rule. That's the connections we're trying to make today. First, let's talk about how to turn a graph into a rule. So what we have to remember is this form of our rules. So we're going to start out with our blank rule, y equals something x plus something. Now we have to remember what those 2 numbers are and how to find them in the graph. So the first number is always the growth. So let's look at the graph and find the growth of our tile pattern. The growth of the tile pattern is 5 because when I went over to figure 1, I went up 5 tiles. I can see that no matter where I go, no matter which 2 points I travel between. So when I went from figure 0 to figure 1, I ended up going up 5. From figure 2 to figure 3, I would go up 5. And remember, the reason it's 5 is because I went from 10 to 15. Now, I found my growth, and I can add that into my rule. The next number I need to find is my figure 0, or my y-intercept. Figure 0 is, at 0, we go up to our line, and we see that it's at 10. So my rule is 5x plus 10, and I'm done. Find the growth, find figure 0, and you have your rule. Let's try it again with a different graph. So again, that first number is always the growth. So we're going to look at our graph and walk from figure 0 to figure 1 and see that we go up 2 tiles because we went from 4 to 6. So that's 2 tiles bigger. So our growth is 2. The next number we need to find is figure 0 because that's the number we always add on in our rule. So looking at the graph, we go to figure 0 and we go up to our line and we see that it's up at 4. So our rule is y equals 2x plus 4. And you're done. Those are the 2 key pieces of information you need to write any rule for any situation, table, or graph. Now it's your job to do the next 3 problems. After you finish questions 1, 2, and 3, you'll watch the next video that's linked in your YouTube channel here. So try questions 1, 2, and 3, and then watch the next video.